am hosting tonight's after dinner conversation from RPEC. And, these are just casual conversations that we started during COVID so that we could do some programming together and that we could, actually the goal of the after dinner conversation was to sort of highlight the work that local activists are doing and to learn from the lessons of the local activists and to learn how we can apply them to any issue that's happening in Richmond or around the world if we, learn from those lessons. And so we have invited tonight Mike Stone from the Virginians Against the Death Penalty. And, they have had a stupendous victory, last year. And so it's a really good opportunity to kind of learn from the lessons from the past. So I wanted to just start by kind of asking Mike if he could tell us a little bit about himself and first of all, and how he came to this issue. If you could just kind of tell us, what were you doing before you came to the VADP and what drew you to that organization?
Great. I am not a native Virginian. I grew up in St. Louis, but I moved to Virginia in 1984 to go to work for Bishop Walter F. Sullivan at the Catholic Diocese of Richmond. And I spent 25 years working in social ministry. And in that, did a lot of social justice work on a variety of issues through the years. But very soon after I came to Virginia in 1984, there was an execution at the old state penitentiary down on Belvedere. And I was one of about 40 people standing under about a 20-foot high brick wall that was topped with razor wire. And we were holding silent vigil with candles. And on the other side of Belvedere were well over 100 drunken revelers who were celebrating the execution and doing so with vulgar and racist signs and chants. And it was a deeply disturbing experience for me personally. And up until that time, I had kind of a vague intellectual opposition to the death penalty, but one that I hadn't thought about or considered a whole lot. And, but that moment really crystallized for me how wrong the death penalty had to be if it could do this kind of a thing to our culture and our society. And that really galvanized my opposition. And ironically, at the 25 years while I was at the diocese, there was always someone else in our office who was running point on criminal justice on the death penalty. So I never did that directly until after I left the diocese, and then ended up working 4 years for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty as a field organizer, including a lot of work here in Virginia. And then for 6 more years as the executive director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So that's sort of my background and how I got engaged in the issue.
That's interesting because what stood out to me from what you said was how the death penalty affects society. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And I think I'm going to circle back to that. But could you tell us a little bit about the organization? Sure. And about the history of the organization?
Yeah, VADP was founded in 1991, though there were organizations before that time that had worked on the death penalty. But our group was founded in 1991. And for most of its period, in the early days, it was at the height of the death penalty in Virginia, where 8, 10, 12 people a year were being sentenced to death and similar numbers were being executed. And back in that period of time, the organization was largely what I would call an outsider / prophetic organization, kind of denouncing the system as it was, because at the time it had massive political support in both political parties in Virginia, and trying to protest, trying to do public education through the media and with programs in churches and civic groups around the state. But it was large, we were, very ineffective in terms of policy because there was overwhelming public support and overwhelming political support for the system as it was. But over time, that atmosphere started to slowly shift. And through different leadership changes within the organization, we became less of kind of an outside prophetic organization and more of an inside policy organization, where we were, instead of laughed out of the room at the General Assembly, we began being respected and heard seriously about what we had to say over a course of time, over those years. And so over time,
that's a really interesting point. So I want you to can expand on that some more, like how the organization pivoted to that, and yeah, that's
well, I mean, we were reacting to the reality on the ground. Going to the General Assembly, if you tried to introduce an abolition bill in the 90s or early 2000s, it would be laughed out of committee on the first day of the session. You just weren't taken seriously because of the overwhelming political support for it as a policy issue. So the focus was then, trying to, in a sense, wage guerrilla war against the death penalty, using the media to tell stories about the problems in the system, doing vigils on the nights of executions, not only the execution sites, but local vigils around the Commonwealth, in several in Northern Virginia, in Norfolk, in Richmond, in Lynchburg, in Roanoke. So there were vigils in many localities. I think at one point we had close to 25 local vigils going on in different parts of the state on nights of executions. So we did what we could given the climate. And as the climate shifted, the organization strategy and tactics shifted accordingly.
So you think that it was more about the climate changing and then you responding to that, rather than it was an active decision that you all made to just change your tactics first?
It was a little bit of both. It was like one of our board, I hadn't been involved with the organization directly for the whole period of time, but I've heard stories about how shifts in leadership on the board helped move the organization in a different direction over a course of time. And, and I think that's healthy for any organization to assess where it is. Is it being effective, what it's currently doing? And if not, how do we pivot to better meet our end goals in the current climate?
Yeah.
With the resources we have at our disposal.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really important conversation for people to have. I noticed you use words like we were an outsider organization and we became an insider organization. And I think maybe you were viewed as a more professional organization then, because
I think that was part of it. Different maybe people that in leadership that presented themselves maybe a little bit differently. And also I think the shifting climate too, that the idea of reform of the system or abolition didn't seem so outlandish 5 years ago than when it did 25 years ago. And a big reason for that shift in climate was the remarkable record of capital defense attorneys in this state. For many, many years, an overwhelming number of people accused of capital murder are indigent and can't afford counsel. And for many years, it was a court-appointed attorney who often had no training whatsoever in the very highly specialized field of capital law. And some of them had never even tried a felony case in a courtroom and were suddenly charged with defending the life of someone, in a capital murder trial. And not surprisingly, huge numbers of people were sentenced to death. But in I think it was about 2004, 2005, or thereabouts, the whole system of indigent defense in the Commonwealth was so obviously broken that the Virginia Supreme Court issued an opinion saying that while we're not going to declare the system unconstitutional now, we're putting the General Assembly on notice. Unless things change, we will be forced to do so soon. And so the General Assembly appointed a study commission, and the result was the creation of something called the Indigent Defense Commission to do training and to professionalize attorneys who do indigent defense. And as part of that, creation of 4 regional capital representation centers whose exclusive purpose was to defend people in capital murder trials. So suddenly you are getting an ill-equipped, underfunded, court-appointed attorney and to getting a top-notch attorney who is trained at William and Mary Law, UVA Law, or at Yale or Harvard, with experienced criminal investigators and social workers doing mitigation work. And you had this very effective team, and suddenly the number of death sentences plummeted. And I'll just share a chart to kind of show you how dramatic that change was. The one thing that I didn't mention is that Virginia is the leader in the number of people executed in the United States, 1,390 people from 1608 till the current day. And Virginia had the first documented execution in 1608, only a year after the founding of Jamestown. But here in red, you see the number of death sentences in the late 90s. And then it was right about 2004 that the regional capital representation offices came online. And you can see the precipitous decline in the number of death sentences, even while the murder rates were largely level with some year-to-year differences. But the last person sentenced to death in Virginia was in 2011. And by the time we abolished the death penalty in 2021, there were only 2 people left on death row.
Wow. And that was largely due to the change in how they were given lawyers.
Correct. And
Wow.
that these attorneys were superb attorneys, well-trained, with the resources to really mount an adequate defense. Because I have so many contacts nationally, Pennsylvania still has the system we used to have of court-appointed attorneys. And as a result, Pennsylvania has a large number of death sentences imposed year in and year out, but on appeal, 90% of those are overturned because of incompetent counsel.
Wow.
And inadequate defense. So it's
I was totally kind of unaware of that change and I would assume that most people are kind of unaware of that change and how people are appointed lawyers.
Yeah, that's the way the system is in many states that still have the death penalty. It is court-appointed counsel. And again, many of them very ill-equipped and ill-prepared to wage an effective defense in a capital murder trial.
Wow. So I was also wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, what you see as, or what are the main concerns that you had with the death penalty?
Sure. We could spend an awful lot of time on that, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. Probably the number one issue, and the one that troubles people across the political spectrum, is innocence. Executing an innocent person for a crime that he or she did not commit. And in Virginia, we only have one person who had been exonerated from death row, Earl Washington, many, many years ago, about 20 years ago. But nationally, there are now close to 200 people that were sentenced to death in the last few decades that on appeal were later found to be factually innocent for one reason or another. And in a large number of those cases, it's either prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, or both. And then the number two reason is witness misidentification, witnesses getting it wrong. People think that our memories are somehow very good at identifying people that we don't know, but in fact, we're horrible at it. And that, so that's a very, very big thing. The second thing is major issue is that the system glamorizes killers and traumatizes family members of murder victims, because our system, in every other criminal trial, if you are convicted, that's the end. But the Supreme Court ruled quite rightly that death is different. And so there are extraordinary protections built in to try to ensure that we do not execute an innocent person. So in every other criminal conviction, you can appeal, but you have to prove to judges that you have serious grounds for an appeal in order to be heard. But in death penalty cases, the Supreme Court has ruled both state courts and federal courts must provide appeals, no matter what the grounds are. And as a result, the finality of convictions in death cases in Virginia, we're fastest in the nation, on average about 7 years from conviction to execution. That's by far away the fastest in the country. In many states, it's 15, 20, 25 years. And then you have the same case being litigated in the media year in and year out, with pictures of the killer in the headlines in social media, on television, in print. And victim family members get traumatized by that time and time and time again. And so as a result, there's an increasing number of murder victim family members that have come out and said the system does not help us. And finally, the other big reason is that it's insanely expensive to execute someone in this system. That depending on different state studies, it could be anywhere from 2 to 20 times more expensive to sentence and execute someone than it is for them to spend their entire 40 or 50-year life behind bars.
Well, and then also it's rarely administered across the board fairly according to race.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, we could go on and on. I talk about the death penalty is the poster child for everything wrong in our criminal justice system. Our board chair is a Black defender, and she worked for many years in capital murder cases. And she wrote a very powerful op-ed that was published in June or July of 2020, talking about how in many capital murder cases, she and her client were the only non-white faces in the courtroom, and that in those same courtrooms were often portraits of Confederate generals and political leaders looking down on the proceedings. And so you have massive racial disparities in death penalty cases. That's another very large issue. And like I said, I could go on, there are more. But
yeah, well, I know that you know that I have a personal experience also with this issue a little bit, because I have a family member who was murdered, and for me, I had to come to terms with. I had always intellectually been against the death penalty, but I had to come to terms with just in this one personal case, like how, once, even though if you might be intellectually against it, I personally would probably have liked to have gone out and killed him, you know what I mean? But for me, I also feel like I don't want the state killing people. I just feel like, it's a slippery slope where if the state kills people, it can be, down the road, if it turned into an authoritarian regime, I mean, who knows what they're killing people for, So, I mean, it's just, but if it's across the board, you don't do it, then it makes it easier. So for me, that was a big issue. And also just go ahead.
It's interesting that all 8 members of the General Assembly in 2021 who were family members of murder victims all voted for abolition.
Wow.
And several of them spoke very powerfully and eloquently on Senate or House floors during the debate on the bill about how executions do not help all victim family members.
No.
They just do not. Senator Janet Howell, in a committee meeting years ago, shared the story about how her father-in-law was murdered during a home invasion robbery, and that up until that point, she had been a Democrat, a Democratic senator from Northern Virginia, but a strong supporter of the death penalty. But she's talked about how the trauma of it was turned inward within the family when family members disagreed with one another about whether the perpetrator should be executed or not. And she talked about how it nearly destroyed her family.
Wow.
And that is just one of the ways in which victim family members get re-traumatized by our criminal justice system when death is on the table.
Interesting. Wow. Well, that kind of brings me to, I know one of your tactics, I guess, or your strategies was in also working with victims and, people on death row. So I was wondering if you could tell us, and if it's not too, I guess, personal, but if you could tell us a little bit about some of the people that you've worked with and that you've encountered during your work.
Well, let me start by doing another screen share. And I just want to highlight, these are some of the remarkable people that helped end the death penalty in Virginia. Attorneys who were involved in litigating, either defending indigent people at trial in capital murder cases or litigating them in appeals. And Christina in the center top is our board chair, who wrote that op-ed I mentioned earlier. Some just really remarkable people. And here are just some of the murder victim family members that are active within Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Just remarkable and courageous people. And we have about 25 that are willing to be public, and there are more that are supportive of us, but are not willing to be public, either because they don't want to face harassment in their local communities, or because there's so much anger within their families about people who didn't want to see persons executed, that them being public would only really further traumatize other family members. But the woman who was most remarkable is this young lady, Rachel Sutphin. She's now, I think, third or fourth year in her work in seminary. I think she's doing post-grad seminary work now. But her father was this man up here. This is Rachel with her father before he was murdered by Will Morva. Will was a mentally disturbed man in the Blacksburg area who was imprisoned for breaking into a 7-Eleven and stealing food. And his parents were hoping that they said if they bailed him out, that he would have just kept on doing the same thing and refusing mental health treatment. They thought if he was jailed, that he might actually get help. And unfortunately, that wasn't true. His mental health just rapidly deteriorated when he was in prison. And for some reason, I forgot if he was injured or was ill and was sent to a hospital with a guard. And while there, he knocked out the guard, grabbed his gun, escaped, shot and killed a guard in the hospital, and then fled into the woods around Blacksburg. And Corporal Eric Sutphin was one of the people out looking for him. And Will got the jump on him, shot and killed him. So Will was later apprehended, and Will refused to see his attorneys or family for after he was convicted of capital murder, because he was convinced that everybody was involved in a conspiracy to keep him from his life's mission of saving Native American people. And so Rachel made a public plea to then Governor McAuliffe to spare more of his life because of his mental illness, and that death wasn't going to do her or her family any good. And unfortunately, Will ended up being the last person executed in Virginia. But Rachel became our most outspoken advocate for abolition among murder victim family members. Just was really remarkable, speaking in many venues around the state, speaking with the media time and again, appearing at legislative hearings and testifying. It's really a remarkable young woman who was really a great champion of our cause.
And what about some of the people that you've met on death row? What's kind of stands out to you?
VADP in its early years did do death row advocacy, mainly because there were very few other people around doing that. But again, as time went on, Marie Deans moved into the state and started doing phenomenal death row work. Death row chaplains started to really do good work. And the Virginia Center on Capital Representation was established to provide post-conviction legal representation for those on death row. So again, that was part of the mission shift, more toward public education and policy than away from working with individuals. Though there are a number of people that I will, give me a minute and I will share another photo of exonerees. In addition to Earl Washington, 18 people that were convicted of murder in Virginia since 1989 have been exonerated. And wow. These are folks that I've had the privilege of getting to know. David, Beverly, Michael, and Keith. Keith in particular wrote a very powerful op-ed about how the only reason he's alive is that after he was wrongly convicted of rape and murder, he wasn't sentenced. The only reason he wasn't sentenced to death is that the Virginia law at the time said that in order to be eligible for death, you had to have raped the person and then killed them. In this case, he was convicted of raping a woman and killing the husband. And so technically he wasn't eligible for death. So instead he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And he rotted in prison for over 30 years. And the only evidence against him was testimony of, he was a sailor at the time, and that a sailor had attacked the survivor, the woman who survived rape. And she couldn't identify him positively. And a gate guard changed his testimony after undergoing hypnosis to saying that Keith had come in at a earlier time than he originally said, and that he had blood on his uniform. which was different than his original testimony. And the other was two experts saying that he was the only person on the earth who could have left the bite marks on the victim's body, which turned out to be rubbish. And in fact, there was a report, a lab report, that excluded Keith as being the possible perpetrator that was never given to the defense attorney in the case. And that came to light only decades later, and he was eventually exonerated. Again, those are examples of people who could easily have been executed wrongfully, and all in Virginia.
Right. Yeah, that's why I just feel like when the state, you know, the state shouldn't be in charge of killing people. but so what I'm really I guess most interested in these conversations is any kind of lessons from your 20 years of organizing that you could pass on to everybody else in Richmond about whatever issue that we're working on. But I think the idea that you pivoted, you know, to kind of a more professional organization is important. And then there were some other things that you said, something that I said would circle back to, and I've forgotten what it was. But anything that you can, you know, tell us about some of the lessons that you've learned over the years.
Yeah, I'd say one thing is never assume someone is not on your side. And just to give an example, I assume a lot of people on this call have probably lobbied for gun control at the General Assembly. And for those who have, the name Philip Van Cleef may ring a bell. Phil is the ringleader of the group of people that shows up every year packing heat and loudly proclaiming the right to bear weapons any place and at any time they want. And so one time I remember reading an article about Phil and saying, wouldn't it be amazing if he was an opponent of the death penalty and got up at the General Assembly and testified for abolition? I could see legislators' heads explode. And so I just called him out of the blue and said, hey, Phil, this is the work I'm doing. Would you be willing to sit down over coffee sometime? And we talked close to an hour and a half, had a fascinating conversation. You know, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but one thing I found out in that call is that he and his organization were strong supporters of restoration of felon rights, because they had a large number of guys in his organization were avid hunters and had been convicted of felonies for different marijuana related charges, and they couldn't legally own guns to hunt, which was kind of part of their DNA. And so he was a big supporter of restoration of felon rights, including the right to vote, because a lot of his members also couldn't vote. And so we found a lot of common ground. He was an ex-cop, and he talked about seeing how police did their work, and he knew from firsthand experience how police engage in misconduct to get convictions, and that the wrong people are often convicted of crimes. And he said, you know, if I wasn't in this very highly public position, I'd probably be willing to testify for abolition. But he couldn't do it because he didn't want to drag the gun rights movement into the abolition issue. But he was very sympathetic. And I think that's just one example of don't assume. And another one of our supporters in the General Assembly is Senator Bill Stanley. Now, Bill is one of the most conservative legislators at the General Assembly. He is he took Governor Northam to court over, you know, mask mandates in businesses, opposing it, you know, representing people. And he's also a huge Second Amendment guy. But he ended up being a very powerful Republican voice for abolition during the General Assembly. So I guess number one is don't assume because of other issues, someone may not be with you. Be willing to talk to anyone and everyone. And if you can't agree, then you say, okay, we'll agree to disagree and move on to talk to someone else. But don't assume is one lesson I really learned. And the other is that it's really important to recruit what we call in the abolition movement, unexpected allies or spokespeople. For example, one of the most powerful spokespeople we had for many years was a man by the name of Jerry Gibbons. Jerry was a guard in the Department of Corrections who ended up leading the execution team in Virginia. And he killed 62 people, first through the electric chair and then lethal injection in that role. And then he later had an epiphany in life. The way he put it, God told him one day that it's not man's job to take a life. And he became, and also what really shook him was Earl Washington, because he was getting ready to execute Earl Washington when a stay was issued. He was, I think, less than 48 hours from being executed, and Jerry was already practicing his team to execute Earl when that came down. And so that really shook Jerry. And I think he carried a great deal of guilt to his dying day about whether he executed any innocent people. And he would speak to anybody at any time about his experiences and why he opposed the death penalty. The victim family members like Rachel Sutphin were critically important in public education. Nobody cares what I think about the death penalty. Oh, you're just a do-gooder, what do you expect? But when Jerry would speak, or when Rachel or another victim family member would speak, or someone who had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for a crime they didn't commit speaks, that gets people's attention and it gets legislators' attention. So I think it's really, really important to get people you don't expect to be spokespeople for your cause.
Mm-hmm. Now I remember what I was going to circle back around to was this question of what the death penalty does to this guard reminded me of it, what the death penalty does to the society. You mentioned what it did to the guard who killed somebody, but what does the death penalty say about our society, and what does it do to us as people? What are your thoughts about that?
Whenever I talk about the death penalty, one of the key parts of my presentation is what I call the collateral damage of capital punishment. People talk about, justice in executions, but I talked already about how carrying out an execution can traumatize victim family members. They can traumatize prison guards, members of the execution team. There was a judge who sentenced someone to death in a non-jury trial, in a bench trial, sentenced someone to death in Virginia, and our field organizer, Dale Brumfield, established a relationship with them, and he told him over coffee that to this day he regrets that decision. And how that haunts him, having sentenced that person to death. At an event in Northern Virginia some years ago, this man came up to me after the presentation saying, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." And he told me about, he was on the jury for, on the one jury trial for the 9/11 attack. The one guy who was captured before the 9/11 attacks, who was part of the conspiracy. And it was tried, it was a federal death penalty case tried in Northern Virginia. And this man was in the jury pool and sat through the trial. And there was no question that the guy was guilty. But he was appalled by the conduct of the prosecutors in the case, doing their best to manipulate the emotions of the jurors to ensure a death verdict. And he was just, appalled by it. And he talked about how during the jury deliberations, there was a large bowl of Tylenol on the table, and that how jurors almost constantly were popping these because they were under so much stress and pressure by the prosecution to issue a death verdict. And, he just talked about what a traumatizing experience that was.
Yeah.
And there have been other cases of jurors in cases that have been shown to be innocent talk about how those instances haunt them, and how that they believed what the prosecutors were telling them and discounted any other argument, and having, really being shaken that they had put their trust in the wrong people at trial. So there are a lot of people that are traumatized, not to mention prosecutors and defense attorneys. There was a real powerful video in Louisiana of a man who had sentenced many people to death, and when one was found to have been innocent, it really shook him to the core. And how he tried to make amends and felt that there was no way he could ever make amends for what he had done. And then, the attorneys at trial, imagine that you're tasked with trying to save the life of another human being and you fail, and that person is executed. The way that will be with you for a very long time.
Yeah.
Brian Stevenson, if you haven't read his book, Just Mercy, I highly recommend it. He talks about how the perpetrator of a terrible crime like homicide might deserve to die, but that society doesn't deserve to be sullied by actually carrying out such an offense, that it cheapens and sullies the criminal justice system and society as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way that I feel as well. But like I said, I've if you are a victim, in some sense, you want to do it yourself, but you don't, you don't want to want other people to do it for you either. It's
there's I forgot the gentleman's name, but he was from Oklahoma City, and his daughter was one of the many killed in the Oklahoma City bombing. And he talks about how for the 6 months he lost his mind and wanted to kill Timothy McVeigh himself.
Yeah.
And that he started drinking very heavily, went into a very deep downward spiral. And he said it wasn't until he could let go of that anger and hatred that he started to come out of it, and also realized that his daughter had spoken about how she had opposed the death penalty, and that executing him would dishonor her memory.
Yeah, there's some been a lot of work. I think Ben Worthington, I don't know if you're familiar with him. Do you know of his work? He was a professor at VCU who was a psychology professor, and his mother was brutally murdered in a home invasion. And he had actually done work on forgiveness before, for years before this occurred. And then after it occurred, of course, then he had to confront that issue for himself. And so I think one of the things that really helped me when I heard him talk about it was this idea that yeah, intellectually it's one thing to let go of the anger, and forgiving is not something that you necessarily do for them. It's something that you do for yourself because you're letting go of that anger. But then what he said was that it was something that that there was the intellectual level, but then there was also this emotional level that you have to get through. So that for me made a whole lot of sense, that, because on one level, yeah, I was totally against the death penalty, but then, when it happens to you, like, well, what do you do with that? Intellectually, there's a whole bunch of arguments against it, but when you're a victim, there's still all that stuff that comes up. So
yeah, let me just give you a quick example. Another one of our phenomenal victim family leaders is Lynnell Patterson. She was either a freshman or sophomore at Eastern Mennonite when her father and stepmother were sexually abused and tortured and murdered in a home invasion. And she talks about how, even now, like 15, 20 years later, there are more layers to unpeel of that trauma and healing. And one of the things that she ended up doing was going through this program. It happened in her home state of Pennsylvania. She lives in Harrisonburg now, but the crime happened in Pennsylvania. That she actually met with one of the perpetrators face to face in prison. And she said that experience brought a lot of closure to her. The other thing she talked about way back in the early days, going to trial, she felt that the prosecutor really ignored her and her sister, who pleaded not to seek death in the case. And not only did the prosecutor ignore them, and he said that as soon as they said that, he essentially shoved them out of the picture and didn't want to have anything to do with them after that, because he was going to do it no matter what they felt. And so they were traumatized by that, and that they felt that in the courtroom, the only people that they could relate to were the women who were the sisters and mother of the people on trial for the crime. And that they were the only ones they felt understood.
Wow. Yeah, it just seems to me that there's a whole lot of issues with how it's administered, just depending on the whims of attorneys and judges, rather than than really kind of seeking justice. And so to me, that's kind of a big issue.
It's interesting. One of the great champions in the abolition movement in the United States was a man named Rennie Cushing. Rennie, remarkable guy, a native of New Hampshire. His father was shot and killed in his own house by somebody who was angry with him over something or other. I don't remember exactly what. And Rennie had always been opposed to the death penalty, and he was really taken aback when a friend of his said to him, well, I hope the SOB fries, that will make you feel better. And Rennie was just puzzled by that. Why would I feel better? That's not going to help my dad. Yeah. It's not going to help me. And it's a violation of everything we believe in as people. And he ended up becoming a champion, not only of death penalty abolition, but of crime victim rights in the United States, was a national leader in both movements, and spoke internationally and around the country about both victim rights and abolition. And, he talked about there's something really sick in our culture where every other show on television uses murder as a form of entertainment. Just all the crime shows are almost exclusively about murder cases, and that all these reality shows about delving deep into murder cases, it's just, he said, a sign of a severely sick society. Yeah. And every time those things come on, he's traumatized by it.
I don't watch things like that. I mean,
sometimes you just turn it on and there it is. You don't even realize it, and you're slammed in the face with it. And and that we are a culture that glorifies violence and really gives a cold shoulder to those who are traumatized by violence.
Interesting. Well, what's next, since we had this great victory last year of abolishing the death penalty in Virginia? What's next?
Well, our board met last year after the victory to address that very question. And they decided to stay in business at least to the end of last year to see what would happen in the last November elections, because if they felt if candidates that supported abolition won the governor's seat, and if the Democrats who supported 100% abolition in the House retained power, then we were good for 4 years and we wouldn't have to worry about defending the victory, because a number of states have had the death penalty victories reversed, most recently in Nebraska about 7 or 8 years ago. And so when the November elections went the way they did, they decided to keep us going at least through April so that we would be around. We hired a lobbyist, and there was a bill introduced to reinstate the death penalty for the murder of law enforcement officers. And sadly, the day before the Senate hearing on that bill was the day when the 2 Bridgewater University police officers were shot and killed. So the next day, the Senate hears a bill on the death penalty for the murder of law enforcement officers. And thankfully, the bill was defeated, and we were able to build enough Republican support in the House so that the bill was never even heard in committee. So right now, we are working to try to increase the number of Republicans in the House of Delegates that oppose the death penalty. 2 voted against it last session, and there was only 2 vote majority in the Republican-held House, so that even if the bill got out of committee, the best that could be hoped for was it would fail on a tie vote. And we learned at least 2, maybe 3 of the newly elected Republican members of the House of Delegates seem to be also opposed to the death penalty, and we're going to meet with more of them in the summer when the General Assembly session, the veto session, and the budget are finally resolved, to begin dialoguing with as many of those Republicans as we can. Because if we can get 6 or 8 Republicans firmly opposed to reinstatement of the death penalty, then we're golden. It doesn't matter whether the Republicans take the Senate in 2023. If we can have that bulwark in the House, then the victory will be secure. So again, our big focus is continuing to build conservative opposition to reinstatement of the death penalty, because there are a lot of libertarians and a lot of legislators who oppose abortion that also oppose the death penalty, that think that it's wrong to oppose abortion, but then to turn around and support the death penalty. So those are the 2 big issues that drive a number of conservatives. And so we're trying to organize them and to kind of keep them solidly opposed to reinstatement.
So the lesson is even though you've won, not to just sort of like give up and go home, to just sort of.
Well, you got to gauge the political reality. And when the political wind shifted last November, we knew we had to stay in business to defend the victory. And sure enough, there was a bill to reinstate.
Well, at this point, I'd like to sort of open it up. If anybody has any questions, and you can put the questions in the chat, or you can just go ahead. We're a small group tonight. You can just go ahead and direct a question to Mike.
Mike, I was wondering if in your discussion last year, you considered taking up other issues related to the death penalty, such as, I guess in the newspapers, there's been some talk about solitary confinement.
There's no shortage of criminal justice issues that we could have decided to focus on. We looked at what other state abolition groups did when their states abolished the death penalty. In almost all the cases, they closed their doors. In only one other case in New York, did the organization shift its name and mission to work on other criminal justice issues. And in Virginia, what the board decided was not to do that for two reasons. Number one is that they were worried we would need to defend the victory after November, and sure enough, that did happen. But the other reason was that a fear that if we did take on other issues, that would fracture our coalition, because we have people across the political spectrum, diehard Republicans, libertarians, and many varieties of Democrats and independents. And I think you would find very little common ground among them all, other than their opposition to the death penalty. So part of the fear was that if we took on other issues, that might hinder our ability to defend the death penalty.
Thank you. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that I mentioned Bill Stanley, and the fact that we gave him an award for his work on abolition a few years back. We lost some members who were so angry with us because of his positions on other issues that they left the VADP. So it's like, it's amazing that some people are, in their own political views, are so set that they can't countenance talking to the enemy on even though they share common ground on that one issue.
Hey, Mike, Rob Jones. That was actually kind of what I was curious about, is I've heard you sort of making common cause with lots of folks who sometimes don't like to make common cause. I'm just curious how that experience has been in this time of we don't talk to the people that don't agree with us kind of thing. I mean, you've seen an arc, I'm sure, but I was curious about how that's been.
Well, we lost a $500 a year donor when we gave that award to Senator Stanley. It's just one example. I wish we still had that $500 a year donor, because money is short these days. Hard to raise money for VADP right now when we've already won. But yeah, so, again, the board and the leadership, you make tactical decisions. That we felt that the best way to achieve abolition was to do it in a bipartisan way, because that way we were less likely to have the victory reversed. If it was solely a partisan issue, then when the legislature and the governor changes, that puts your victory at risk. And so we felt it was really, really important to be as bipartisan as possible. And we do have,
I completely understand that. And I guess my
some
question
people can't
is,
hear that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we could have drinks and have a different conversation, but the one I'm curious about now is how hard has it been to be bipartisan over the last 5 or 6 as opposed to the previous 5 or 6? You don't hear that many places where folks are successful in being able to actually hold coalition. So I'm just curious what that experience has been like.
Well, it helps because we're single issue, that we don't get into life in prison without parole. We don't get involved in solitary confinement. We don't get involved in mandatory minimums. So, if we did, again, we would risk fracturing the coalition that we had put together. But yeah, I mean, I think it helps that I'm a political agnostic. I really despise both political parties right now, and have for over a decade. And so it doesn't bother me to talk to someone who's aligned with any party or no party, because I don't think much of either of them. So if I can find common ground, I don't care what label you slap on yourself, I'm willing to work with you.
Interesting answer. Anyone else have any other questions or thoughts? Well, we do really appreciate you joining us, Michael, and thank you so much for the work that you've done over the last 20, 30 years, I guess. And congratulations on the success that you've had. You know, if let us know if there's any way that we can work together in the future.
Will do. Thanks so much. And thank you for the invitation. And it's great seeing some familiar faces on the call tonight, folks I haven't seen for a while. So hope you all are well, and good luck with RPEC and its important mission in the future. Both my wife and one of my sons have served on the board at one time or another, and I served on the board at one point as well. So the RPEC mission is dear to my heart.